everyone, and welcome to our first podcast for gettingtobettertogether.org. And we're going to talk about what is the meaning of a good life. And I'm here with my fellow director, Richard Bawden. My name is Tami, Harriott, and we're just going to have a little chat about what does it really mean? What are we talking about when we say a good life, and what is it in the context of development?
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first thing I want to say is often when we talk about development and sustainable development, we always think of the sustainable development goals. But I think what's missing for me in that is, what is it all about? You know, what are we trying to achieve? I know we have all these aspirations and all these goals, but what are we really trying to achieve? And what does it mean for us as we go on this journey about getting to better together?
Well, one of the implications, of course, of the goals is that there is an assumption in the end you score one. So that in the end, that it's no longer talking about getting to better, it's having got there.
Okay.
So we've eliminated poverty.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's somewhat absurd.
Yeah.
So for me, the notion of getting to better remains a verb. It's an action. And therefore, the one that's really important of the 17 is climate.
Yeah.
Because that ain't getting better. In fact, it's getting seriously worse.
Okay. So what does it mean? So I take a little different approach to all this, because I always think about, for me, the climate is a component of a good life, but what am I actually aspiring to when I talk about a good life? And when I think of all the things that we do in our society, the things that we're losing our sense of community, we're losing our sense of collaboration, and we seem to be petering off to the periphery, right? It's the extremes on one side or the extremes on another. So what do you think about that? What do you think about what is this good life that we're all aspirationally seeking, and how do we as an organization help to support communities in getting there?
Well, I think of all the years when I was a student of trying to make sense of Aristotle and his whole notion of happiness. Yes. Which really has to do with goodness of soul, was the way he put it. But it's really have to do with the fulfillment of what it is we're doing in life. And that includes collaboration. That unless you're doing with somebody, getting to better together, A, you're not likely to get to better alone. Yeah. B, getting to better together puts a different focus on it anyway, doesn't it?
It does. But do you think this idea of getting to better is really about exploring this concept of a good life? Like, for me, happiness, I can never say that I truly understand happiness. And when I think about Aristotle, I think he talks about it in terms of a pursuit of something. Like happiness is something we pursue versus an end state that we are at. And I always think about, like, as we look at our society, it seems like people want more and more and more and more. And in order to get that more, it becomes a zero-sum proposition where we're taking away, instead of building out, we're taking away from others. And so this notion of a good life for me is the satisfaction, and sometimes, Aristotle would say it's a golden mean, that average, It's about not having everything, but having enough to suffice.
I like the little metaphor of saying you're on your deathbed and you have a few thoughts left. But in thinking about that on your deathbed of your life, what do you think you've missed out on? What didn't you do you should have done? Yeah. So it's a sort of moral imperative. It's not just a good or happiness in the smiley sense. Yeah. It's the sense of self-fulfillment. Yeah. Have I actually done, in the company of others, what it is I could have done, should have done to fulfill my potential? Okay,
and not just as a personal thing that we do for ourselves, but how do we do for greater good?
Absolutely, yes.
I believe in utilitarian principles of it must be for greater good. Like that for me is, it's not just wealth for wealth's sake, but wealth for others.
Well, I mean, he of course talked about virtue, didn't he?
He did.
So the whole idea of an ethical being, in other words, a good person, is that one is virtuous, that therefore one has sets of standards that we share with others, and that when we see behaviour of others that don't fit with that, then we have to question what we actually mean by virtue, and are we ourselves as virtuous as we believe we are? Most of the time, no, we're not.
I know the answer. The answer is a definite no, but I'm going to hold that okay for a little. So what can we do with, I always think about the things that we do in terms of, the next generation. What do we leave? I think on my deathbed, I'll go, what could I have shared with my child and my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren, if I'm so lucky, that will help pave a better way for them. So to get them to focus on the things that are virtuous.
Well, I mean, the tension I've always felt as an educator, as an academic, is what right do I have to try and change somebody else's mind?
Yeah.
And in terms of me making judgments about another person's virtuousness, what right have I got to do that? And I think that that's the most difficult paradox that any educator faces. It's easy to give someone else new knowledge. That's easy. What's much more difficult is to try and help them understand they have a particular perspective on the world, a world view, which includes issues to do with happiness and virtue and goodness and right and wrong and so on. And I often wonder about, what am I doing? Is that right? Is that virtuous?
So you don't feel you can call it out? You don't feel like, you're seeing someone going down a wrong track and you can say, no, that's not going to work because that's going to lead to devastation or it's going to lead to harm to other people. Don't you believe we have an obligation to call it out?
Well, as an example today, as I drove into the car park, there was a student driving the wrong way, coming straight towards me. And I thought, I have a responsibility here.
Yeah. Or your life is on the line, or your life is on the line.
So I flashed my lights and blew my horn and she kept going. So.
Yeah. Not very effective, but...
That's right. Story of my life.
Yeah, but I think we're at this part in our history where we can't connect with each other to call out things that we know are not good for the society. And we have this, it's not just academics that face this, I think generally we face this. When I was growing up, the whole neighborhood was your parent.
Yeah, that's right.
They all disciplined you, and it was part of the rite of passage for people to say, don't do that. Now we take offense. And I think that we're getting disconnected in that process, and that we're not looking out for each other. So instead of being community, we're individuals. And that individual action is probably what's stemming a lot of greed. People can hoard it for themselves because they're not connected to their communities.
No, I agree. I mean, one of the interesting things about the notion of getting to better, beside it being a verb and therefore an action, is to say what actually constitutes better.
Yeah.
And then the secondary question of who decides.
Or for whom.
For whom, yes.
Yeah.
But the two key questions for me are, what do we actually mean by better? And of course, to take your point, you can't do that alone. No. Well, you can, but it misses the point.
Yeah.
And I can remember many years ago in a cab, and the cab driver turned to me at one stage, and I hadn't been concentrating on him at all, and he suddenly turned to me and said, do you know what I mean? And I had to say, I haven't got a clue what you mean, no. And it wasn't I hadn't been listening, it was that I actually had no idea what he meant.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a really interesting question, so that when someone says something that's getting to better, the question immediately has to become, what do you mean better? And that's an important question.
It is. The same way we talk about a good life. What is a good life? It isn't the same for all of us. But the more temperate we can be, the more we can reach the golden mean, right? So it's not the excesses. When I look at the state of the world today and how power is concentrated in a few with no regard for the masses, there's a part of me that really hurts from that.
There's a nice little phrase that talks about the dominant social paradigm.
Yeah.
In other words, how we do things around here.
Yeah.
And that's driven by sets of beliefs and assumptions and so on. And the important point about that is that they are beliefs and assumptions of a small group. You're quite right.
Yeah.
And they are the powerful group, and they're extraordinarily difficult to change. So you have a group of whatever we want to call them, capitalists or bankers or whatever, who at the moment really decide what it is that will be done. If you think about the fact that there are now over a dozen centi-billionaires.
Correct.
People have over $100 billion, which is more than half the world's nations.
And hundreds of millions of poor people at the same time. That's the thing that bothers me, is that I don't just look at them, but I'm looking at what's happening on the other side.
Sure, absolutely. Well, there are 650 million who are starving right now.
Correct.
As we speak.
And even when we look at the poverty line, even above the poverty line, there are people starving above the poverty line because we have the working poor.
That's right.
We have a lot of people that are working every day that may not be below the poverty line, but living below the expectations that they should for the effort that they put into the society. And I think of the difference between those two groups really is about connectedness. Like, at the top, there's no real connection to the society.
No.
It's a selfish individual thing. At the bottom, we need each other. Our survival is, determined by our ability to be together.
Shifting philosophers and bringing it forward to the 19th century, Immanuel Kant asked 3 profound questions. He said, what can I know, with the emphasis on the can. What should I do? And then the last important one, which I think really sums up what we're talking about, is for what can I hope?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that's the issue of getting to better together. It's a hopeful notion. And I think that if you can actually reflect on what it is that we can know, science tells us some stuff, religion tells us some stuff, spirituality in the non-religious sense tells us some stuff, indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing tells us some stuff, but we don't seem to be able to integrate that. We just take our own little perspective and off we go and say, well, that's the right way. And that seems to me an ultimate tragedy.
But isn't it interesting to you that, as we get more globalized, we get more separated?
Yes, it is interesting, isn't it?
It's really interesting. It's a paradox of what it was intended to do. It was supposed to integrate us, and instead, we've just hard-coded our camps in these various little camps around the world. And we're not even talking to each other. We're so entrenched in our own problems that we can't see how collectively we can solve them together. Right. And that is a little bit scary.
I mean, there is the major concern, isn't it, that democracy is in retreat.
It is.
And that actually means exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
That democracy is really the only political system, as silly as it is, as Winston Churchill said, but there's nothing better.
There's hope.
At the moment. There's hope. That's right. But it's the fact that democracy allows us, and in fact gives us social license, to actually talk to each other.
Yeah.
And to have some influence, no matter how small that might be. But the death of democracy would really mean the end of getting to better together.
Yeah.
It might mean getting to better for individuals, but that would not be together.
But I have a lot of friends that are structuralists, and they'll talk about, well, the system has to, a new system might emerge. But I think that whatever system we have, if we don't get this, the social obligations right, I don't think the system's going to matter.
No.
Right? We have to care about each other. We have to care more than just our lifetime. We've got to care beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think that, so my argument's always going to be, there has to be hope in a system. I think democracy presents that hope, but we have an obligation to make it work as well.
Yeah.
So getting to better together is not a passive thing.
Not at all.
It's something we have to be proactive about. We have to care. We have to, have purpose in what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And to quote yet another philosopher, and going back now to those old days, was Socrates, who essentially said, first know thyself.
Yes.
So that, I'm not sure I actually agree with that. I think that one comes to know oneself through collaboration, through working with others, through being part of a family or a community and a community, belonging to associations and so on. It's through others that you recognize, going back to the deathbed wish, I really ought to do something about that. Yeah.
But isn't it, I find it really hilarious that we're thinking about it in terms of this is the last action we're going to take, right? And maybe that's a problem. We find this in deathbed where we should find it in birth, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe if we can discover it in an earlier period in our lives, then we can move toward that purpose and work together.
I mean, it is a metaphor.
Yeah. I know it's a metaphor, but it's more like reality for me, because when I see people, they sort of get that social conscience as you age and you realize that time's nearing, right? And this is your last chance. But if we can instill that in younger people so that they come up through their years and their journey with a sense of, I have to give back, not just the obligation itself, but the responsibility that's within that obligation. And because that makes us better, that's going to make for a much better society. And that's a society I want to live in.
Well, it's interesting having lived my life. I mean, I was born before the Second World War. And so for me, the gift, I guess, that the previous generation gave me was peace.
Yeah.
That we actually got through the war. And that was relatively simple, which avoided complexity. It was simplicity on this side of complexity, as it were, rather than having to work through the complexity that we're now in. And I love that statement of Oliver Wendell Holmes, the jurist and philosopher in the United States in the 19th century, who said essentially, I'm looking for simplicity on the other side of complexity. We need to work through it.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the things that we're avoiding in our quest for better, in that to do so, it really is a painful journey.
And overwhelming.
Yes, that's right.
And overwhelming, yeah.
And so, I mean, it's so overwhelming that most of the time we don't try and go through complexity.
Yeah.
We simply simplify it first of all.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of the issue to do for me with the sustainability goals. Let's pick something we can actually achieve.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, well, wait a minute, it's the way we're actually approaching the way we live our lives that needs to be questioned, not whether we're emitting or not.
Yeah. And my issue, so I was reading something recently on wind turbines, and they were saying the deforestation that happens to get renewable energy, we need to stop and look, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's in all things that we jump to a solution as an alternative to something else without really the cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly right.
And I think it's a rush to judgment. For me, it's like a rush to do something without sitting back and thinking about it.
Yeah.
You know, who benefits, who gets harmed, creating another problem along the way instead of really solving the problem.
Well, we won't go there because, again, I think that's part of the issue, that we're doing the problem first and trying to solve it, rather than looking at what Brundtland herself said in terms of our common future was problematique. Yeah. The whole idea that it's a mess, as Vasilakov said, is that we really got to try and find patterns.
Yeah.
And so the talk these days of systems approaches really means literally the simplicity on the other side by looking at patterns that complexity itself generates.
Yeah.
So we don't look at simple little things by extracting them quickly and say, oh, yeah, we can fix that. You know, let's eliminate hunger, as if that were possible, but let's say that's a goal. Rather than, I said before, rather than, well, wait a minute, we've actually got enough food in the world. It's just a matter of how we distribute it.
And who consumes it? Because hunger comes with think about developed nations, and hunger comes with obesity, right? Mm-hmm. On the other side of hunger is obesity. Yes. So it's not a rationing of available resources or food resources. It's how consumption is, which we never seem to address.
So all of this is part of this quest for getting to better, right?
Yeah.
That all of these issues need to be discussed and unraveled as we go, rather than ignoring them. And as I think you rightly say, that at the moment there is just such differentiation amongst everything, whether it's nations or whether it's political systems within nations or whatever. It just does seem to me ironic, really, or tragic, even better, is that I came through the Second World War. Now I'm facing what could be a nuclear war.
Yeah.
And that would be an awful end chapter on my deathbed.
Yeah. But simultaneously, Richard, it's not just the war on the outside, the external war, it's a war within. So I look at, it's not that we're only fighting the people on the outside, we're fighting ourselves. Mm-hmm. Look at the rate of assault, look at violence in our nations. And I was looking at domestic violence recently, and that's one of the things that just really shocked me. It didn't matter the country. The numbers were somewhere between 32%, I think 28 was the lowest percentage I had seen, based on definition, to as high as 88%. This is an, where is that in the good life? For whom is that good life? What's causing those pressures in our society that we would feel that level of violence, even at a household level, would be okay? So there's some real tricky questions here for us to answer.
Oh, I think getting to better is one big tricky question.
And hence why we're talking today.
Exactly,
I think that part of it is that how do we engage with everyone in the development realm to say, let's sit down at the table. So this series that we're talking about now is Fruit for Thought. We're trying to bring fruit to the table to talk together as we would break bread together, to have those conversations about what that good life could be and how we can make that accessible to as many people as possible.
You know what I mean?
I do. So back to that cab driver, I do know what you mean. Know what I mean? Bet he's from New York.
He was from New York, as it happens, yes.
Well, any last thoughts?
Well, I think that what I enjoy still working at the age that I am is that, as if academia was working, but the issue of continually challenging ideas, continually looking for better ways, and particularly within the context of the fact that I have 9 grandchildren, and I want to do what I can to make their lives better, selfishly,
yeah,
but believing that in so doing, I may well contribute to general well-being.
Yeah. And I'm looking back, I don't want to have this conversation when I'm dying. I want to do it now when I have the energy, I have the bandwidth, I've got the agency to be able to do something to pay back for the good life that I feel that I've had. And I'm not a great philosopher, but I'm going to end with my thoughts. I am forever frustrated, but never defeated.
Nicely put. A good place to end the conversation.
Thank you all. This was our session. Richard and myself. We thank you very much for listening and hope you can continue to engage in these conversations with us as we explore the good life in the context of getting to better together.
Goodbye.